For now, I would like to invite a colleague and a friend, Dan Moxon, to join us. Thank you for being available for this keynote speech. Dan is a researcher and a practitioner from UK, working especially on youth participation, inclusive youth participation, has been doing research on how the voices of children and youth really have an impact on practice and on policy development. Have been involved in many of the recent processes in terms of youth dialogue, trying to improve, but also special process that is impacting, or hopefully will impact even more, what is the work of the national agencies and consequently of also the organizations, the municipalities that are using the program. That was the youth participation strategy with the support of SALTO participation and information. So thank you very much, Dan, to join us.
Thank you very much for such a kind introduction. It's really nice to be here face-to-face in Portugal as well, which is increasingly, I think, one of the leading countries at municipal level in terms of participation. People often will email me and say, can you tell me who's good at this? And more I'm saying, well, you should probably look at what Portugal's doing. And that's because of some of the people in this room, I think. What I wanted to share with you is just kind of some thoughts and some ideas around what we should be thinking about in terms of participation at municipal level, not in terms of really concrete things or strategies or ideas or goals or targets, but something a little bit perhaps more abstract and more about feelings, really. And much of this is drawn from, before I was active in the European level, I spent a good number of years supporting municipalities in the UK to develop their approaches to participation. And a lot of the time when we're talking about involvement in decision-making, we're talking about a couple of things. We're talking about young people's voices, young people being heard. We're talking about decision-makers listening to young people. And that's a language that comes from very particular places. It comes from the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And it has some ideas in it that we don't often explore. And I want to start by asking you to turn to the person next to you and spend just 20 seconds telling them what you think about the answer to this question. What does it mean to be listened to by someone? And share your thoughts on that just with the person next to you for a few seconds. What does it mean to be listened to by someone? Okay, and I'll pause you there, and I realise that doesn't give you anywhere near enough time for discussion. So maybe one of you feels listened to, and maybe one of you doesn't. But I'd like to invite anyone in the room just to shout out any word that you associate with this idea of feeling listened to. Just anyone to volunteer. If not, I'm going to put Bruno on the spot and make him do it. So I think I just did. Bruno, what does it mean to be listened to you? An availability. An availability. So someone being available there to you. Anyone else? Lacey, what does the idea of being listened to mean to you?
Trying to understand.
There's something about trying to understand. Okay. These are very kind of, not things about politics and decision makings. When you talk about a person listening to you, you talk about emotions, you talk about understanding, you talk about empathy, you talk about someone being there for you. So then the question I have, and I'm not going to ask you to answer this is what you'll be exploring over the next few days. What does it mean to say that a municipality is listening to you? To say that, I mean, what even is a municipality? It's like this weird word, an abstract sort of thing. You can't touch a municipality. It's not sitting there in front of you on a chair, ready to be engaged and listening to what you've got to say. So if your goal, if you're working in participation, is to make young people feel like a municipality is listening to you, you're starting from quite an odd place in a lot of ways, because these ideas of voice and listening, they're about the interpersonal, they're about communication, But what we're talking about probably a lot of the time is politics, processes, policy, these kind of things. So let's break it down a little bit. Let's think about, well, who are the people that need to be listened to? And I think some of the earlier speakers covered this already. If we look at young people today, we know that the vast majority of young people are politically active, politically interested. They're quite switched on to what's going on in the world. They care deeply about a number of different causes, things like the environment that you can see there. It's an absolute myth that young people are, as a whole, are disengaged and uninterested. But what we know from a lot of research is there's increasingly a lack of trust in our democracies. There's increasingly a lack of belief that our political systems represent them. There's increasingly an idea that politicians and politics are very, very distant from the reality of young people's lives. And there's increasingly a sense that there's this huge gap between what young people want from our democracies in the world and what our political institutions are doing. And the further you go up the political tree, if you go to Brussels, this is like a distant, faraway fairyland to most young people. But the municipality is very much the closest connection that many young people have to politics and to democracy, with the possible exception of the school sitting a little bit below that. But even then, the municipality is still a little bit far away. But if you talk about young people as a whole, that's really misleading. And one of the things, this is like a back of the napkin idea I've been playing with for a while, with some very rough, sketchy figures in it. So the idea that all young people are one thing or all young people are another thing is of course nonsense, just in the same way that all people as a whole aren't one thing or another. And if you were to look at who and how is engaged in society, and which young people are engaged in politics, in decision-making and participation, what you would probably see, more or less, is something like this. You would have about 5 to 10% of people that are disengaged at any one point, that are not particularly interested, that are not involved in decision-making at all, not interested in being involved. And that would include a lot of people who perhaps are going through crisis. Maybe they've been made homeless, maybe they've just lost their job, maybe they're very sick and ill in hospital. People who actually have got other things going on in their lives rather than to join a youth forum. They've got other priorities for them. And some people will move in and out of this group at different times, but you will always have groups of people, often some of the most vulnerable in society, who might not be engaged at all. Then I think you'd probably have at the top about 5 to 10% of people who you might call super engagers. These are, I think, exceptionally brilliant and wonderful young people that the youth sector works with a lot. Our youth activists, our youth advocates, people who are involved in every single program or initiative that we do, people who are going to be future leaders. And these are a really important part of our participation work. And I think in participation, we're probably quite good at trying to do work with this top bit and with this bottom bit, of finding the people who are most vulnerable, who have got their rights most left out, and trying to identify and bring them into our work, and working with the people who are very committed and dedicated activists. And that's great. What we're not, I think, so good at doing is working with the 80 to 90% of people in the middle who are sort of quite interested in politics, probably talk about it regularly with their friends, reasonably well switched on to what's going on. Maybe they volunteer once, twice a month, something like that. They're not people who are dedicating their lives to youth participation. And the reason that we find it hard to work with this group is because sometimes if we dip down and reach into this group, we then keep asking the same people over and over again, and then we turn them into the yellow bit at the top, into the super engagers. And sometimes in our work in participation, we talk like what we're aiming to do is to get everyone in the population into this 5 to 10% of super engagers. But of course, that's really unrealistic. Just as it's unrealistic to think about all citizens that way, you need to have a range of people engaged in different ways at different times and in different levels based on what their interests are, based on what time and capacity you have, and just based on the fact that people are different and want different things. So more and more, I think we have to think about scale and size of the number of people in a municipality, the number of young people, and that's really variable depending on how your municipalities are organised. But we're talking tens of thousands of people, maybe 50,000 people, even 100,000 people. So actually, how do we work with that volume and that number of young people? How do we make them feel listened to by the municipality? Rather than just the top section or the bottom section, how do we work at this very large scale? This is really challenging because sometimes I think a municipality is a little bit like a kind of like this abstract UFO that hovers above people. People don't quite know what it is, and every so often it reaches down and it scoops up a young person and brings them into their youth steering group or their youth democracy group, and they get to go inside the spaceship and see everything. But everyone down on the planet below is just like, well, what's this thing above us? I've no idea. I hope they go away and don't steal me next. And so how do we create this sort of spread that's about everyone in that group of people, in that huge range of people, having a voice, feeling listened to, feeling like they can influence things? I don't have the answers to all of that, but I'm going to kind of share with you some of the things we're doing at the moment to give you a bit of a framework of thinking about it, because I think really finding the answers to this solution is something that we're going to explore over the next 2 days and probably the rest of our careers as well. One of the things municipalities do a lot is talking to people, educating and informing young people, telling them what their rights are, telling them how municipalities work, telling them how political processes work. And this is really important, but it's also like, it's not participation. Education is a foundation for society, but education is primarily about changing and informing people. Participation is about enabling people to create changes. There was definitely a point in my life where I decided I was no longer an educator and that what I was a participation worker, but we shouldn't ignore it altogether. That entire group, all those 5%, 20%, 10%, need to be well educated. They need to be informed of how municipal decision-making works. One of the things we have a lot is the idea of being shouted at. And municipalities being shouted at by NGOs and youth civil society. And this is the sort of form of listening and decision-making that happens a lot in this world through representation and advocacy. The idea that you support youth civil society, you support local youth forums, national youth forums, and they chain into these kind of hierarchies and voices get passed up them. This is a very common way of doing participation that you'll be quite familiar with. And it's a really important one that has a lot of great strengths to it. It's youth-led, it focuses on things that are identified by young people that are very important. It supports young people's right to association. They can be very diverse. Youth forums and youth organisations often get unfairly criticised for lacking in diversity, but actually if they're committed to inclusion, they're very good at working with a wide range of young people from different social backgrounds. And they allow young people to take ownership of what they want to say to a municipality, to policymakers, to decision makers. Some of the downsides of them is that by their design, they have a limited number of young people involved in them. They have a limited number of representatives. So in terms of spreading that feeling of being listened to, it's much harder. They have a huge amount of voting and procedures in them. I spent a long time working on a program called Make Your Mark in the UK, it's a kind of national vote for young people to decide what the UK Youth Parliament should do. And we invested probably thousands and thousands of pounds worth of resources trying to get 1 million young people voting in this opinion poll, and it made absolutely no difference. There's a lot of internal procedures that come with these kind of things that take up a lot of time. They can also be slightly out of sync with policy making because they're led by young people, because the issues that they bring up are driven by young people. Sometimes they're just saying the wrong things at the wrong time. If the municipality is in the process of redeveloping its schools and what the youth forums want to talk about is the environment, that really limits the chances of a meaningful and an influential conversation. And actually, it's very hard to do good campaign work in a youth forum setting because young people have this nasty habit of growing up. And so if you look at other parts of civil society, you have activists who've been involved for 10, 20 years, and that's what long-term campaigning work takes. And so the problem we have is this continuous churn of young people changing as they age out of the system, as they move on. So we're always often re-exploring the same ideas through these structures and through these forums. I haven't seen in my 20 years a huge shift in the topics that are talked about in this. And what that does is mean that sometimes these structures' ability to influence and connect to a municipality, when you're sat on the other side of it, when you're with a decision maker who really wants to listen to young people, but says, actually, do you know what I've got here is a strong campaign telling me they want to reduce youth unemployment of the region. Well, everyone wants to reduce youth unemployment. I don't need a group to come and tell me that. No one wants to raise youth unemployment. So sometimes we give very kind of limited messages in some of this work. One of the ways that lets municipalities go a bit deeper into exploring the complexities of policy making is to hold discussions with young people, to do things like deliberation and dialogue events. Lately, I've been using the phrase deliberative democracy quite a lot with people, and sometimes in the youth sector they say, I don't really know what that means, but it's basically just a youth event where you bring a group of people together to talk about a policy topic, to talk about an idea, and think about a structure or a process, what you want to change with that, and you bring that group of young people together, perhaps directly with decision makers. You can have more complex versions of it, things like participatory budgeting, citizens' juries, things with particular structures or processes. But the fundamentals of this is that you're putting the right people in the room to have an extended discussion about something. And the advantages of doing that is that you can make things sync up with policy making very well. If a municipality is looking at how do we redevelop the port in this town, you might hold a series of dialogue events about that topic. And that means that the people coming in, getting involved in that, have much more chance of influencing what the municipality is going to do, of feeling listened to, because that's the topic on the political agenda. And the depth of discussion you can go into in this kind of setting perhaps gives you a slightly more nuanced, deeper idea and useful things for policy that allows municipal decision makers to act on it a bit more. So going back to that youth unemployment example, you might think about things like, how can we reduce youth unemployment? What are the things that are schools doing? What are the things that the colleges are doing? What do we need employers to do? And really get under the skin of an issue. Because I think these days a lot of policymakers really are quite committed to listening to young people, but what they need is the practical tools and good quality knowledge coming from what we do. The downside of these kind of processes, things like participatory budgeting, things like youth events, youth conferences, is that they still only involve quite a limited number of young people. They're quite slow. They take a couple of months to run at their best. They can often generate quite a lot of ideas, and sometimes if they're not really well structured, it's not exactly clear where the outcomes and the influence go. We've all been at a conference that feels meaningless because no one's clear what the outcomes were being used for. Sometimes they actually can be really influential, but people just don't realize it. Fundamentally, these processes are still about getting 50 to 100 people in a room to talk about something. So you're not reaching that entire population, that entire group of young people. One of the other things municipalities do a lot of is asking opinions, youth consultations, surveys, opinions research, and we often kind of are a bit negative about that because it's not really what we who love and care about participation see as, it's not at the top of the ladder of participation, it's not deep, it's not meaningful. But actually a municipality that's systematically asking young people once a year or whenever it makes a major decision what they want from something with a good old-fashioned survey, with a good old-fashioned opinion poll, there's something to be said for that. You know, it's not going to change the world, but what it does do is let you sync it up really strongly with policy making, gives you the information that you need when you need it to be able to influence things, and you can reach a large number of young people with it. Admittedly, no one ever says, oh, I really enjoyed that survey, that was great, I felt so deeply listened to when I ticked box A and B, but it does find out what a lot of people think about something. So actually there is a really important part of municipalities just doing this kind of work, bread and butter, fairly boring sort of stuff. The downsides of it, it's not always based on young people's interests, it's not youth-led, it has this low level of youth participation, it's something that has to be set up and run by decision makers or policy makers by the municipality. That's exactly what consultation is. What I'm really interested in for the future, and this is where the presentation is going to get really sketchy because I don't have any good ideas for this, because it's something we're not really doing very well, and where I think we have the potential to do a lot more, is how we can create continuous dialogue with very, very large numbers of young people on an ongoing scale. And I think there are two ways to do that. One is to have absolutely bucket loads of money so that you can run a youth forum, 30 youth events, a youth council, a consultation every single week. You would need an absolute army of participation workers to do it in our traditional methods. I don't think even Finland can afford that. And certainly in most budgets of municipalities, to do the sorts of face-to-face work we do with that entire scale of the population is not going to be feasible with the sort of resource we have. And not even feasible if we just scaled up that resource as well. So I think the answer is probably going to be around digital modes and digital tools. We have a lot of kind of, I don't know, the last time I spoke about digital tools in person was before the pandemic. And then it was like this amazing, fantastical thing that would save us all. It would reinvigorate democracy if we just built the right digital platform. And it was the future. And then for the last 2 years, I've been on a Zoom call, and I feel slightly more like we have some further work to do. But I'm really interested to see what's come out of the things we've had to do digitally over the last few years. I think a lot of what we've done in the youth sector is actually just try and recreate what we did face-to-face in a digital setting. So we had a digital conference, we had a digital focus group that was like a Zoom call with 10 people in it. And those are fine, but this is not really probably what I'm talking about here. I think what I'm talking about is really large-scale communications work, campaigns work, the sorts of things that big companies do around market research, where they're continuously putting out information, putting out messages about what that company's doing, or in this case, what the municipality's doing, getting feedback from the people that are their consumers, or in this case, our citizens, and seeing what people think about it. And there are some interesting people experimenting with this. There's an interesting project called U-Report, which uses really large-scale text messaging services to get thousands and thousands of people to reply and then automates and analyzes the responses. But it seems to me that the digital realm is the space where we can really create very, very large and permanent conversations with people where they don't have to make the sort of commitment that's necessary to become a super engager, although we'd certainly want to encourage people to go on and do that, where we can have sort of very loose, open and casual conversations about what we want from our municipality, what we want from our decision making, what we want from our local area. Because people do that online anyway. People are continuously talking about what they want to see happening, their opinions, their beliefs. So it's finding a way for the municipality as an entity, as a presence, as a person, or perhaps people acting on behalf of the municipality, like youth workers, like consultation workers, to go into digital spaces and to have these conversations with people. Most of what we've done in this area has been, with the times where it's hit really large-scale work, has often been by chance and ended up with quite comical results. In front of you, you'll see a large brass statue of RoboCop. And I don't know if people can remember RoboCop. It's like an 80s film with a robot guy. And it was set in the city of Detroit. This statue is the result of a participatory decision-making process in Detroit. And for people who are familiar with Detroit, for those who aren't, it's a kind of, it used to make motor cars, it's in America, it's a very kind of, it's been on the downhill for quite a while, to the extent that people are farming in the city centre, a lot of racial tensions. It's a place with a lot of problems. And the one significant idea that came as the thing that would save Detroit from it used a crowdfunding process to enable citizens to put in and participate and say what they wanted to save Detroit. And they decided to build a large brass statue of RoboCop. But there were thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people involved in this, but it doesn't really have any real depth or connection to meaningful participation, in the sense that it's not about the policies of Detroit, it's not about the reality of what's going on in that setting. And we see other similar things. This is a ship that was launched by a sort of environmental society in the UK, and they again ran a similar sort of, can we do a campaign to get people to name the ship for us? Could we reach people to get them to choose what we're doing with this environmental ship. So rather than actually getting people involved in what our environmental policies are, what our institution is doing as a whole, what approach we should be taking to tackling climate change, these kind of meaningful questions, they decided that where they wanted to put their participation was on getting people to name their ship. And the best name, the name that was voted for by thousands of people through a kind of crowd nomination process was Boaty McBoatface. Which then they made the most kind of like heinous crime of then decided that they weren't going to actually listen to what people have said, and they decided to ignore this. So anyone who'd involved in that process, who'd probably never heard of this institution before, decided that they would just, it wasn't an institution that listens to them. They made a choice, they voted on it, and they were ignored. They named the submarine inside it Boaty McBoatface and called the ship the Sir Richard Attenborough ship. These examples are kind of really silly examples, but in some ways it's demonstrating that there is very much a potential for reaching very, very large numbers of young people. And what we're not doing very well is reaching them in a meaningful way, reaching them in a way that actually allows them to think deeply about political decision-making, about the work of municipalities, about what it is that we want as a future for our communities. And if I come back to kind of this thing again, this is really, I think, where the challenge is how do we, taking into account the resources we have at least some level of discussion with very, very large numbers of young people about where our communities are going, where our politics are going. I think the solution to that is probably digital, but there may well be other solutions as well. But I'm absolutely convinced that the answer is not about just doing the same thing that we're doing at the moment, but saying we need more money for it. Because if you do roughly those calculations, you would need so many youth workers. I mean, I would love to see that many youth workers, but you would be talking about more youth workers than there are doctors, more than there are teachers, more than there are pretty much any other workforce in the world, probably more than there are in the army. So that gives you an idea of, like, there are obviously some limits to how much we can say the sorts of face-to-face work we do should be resourced. And so I think we need to think about these new strategies that will reach very, very large numbers, this 80 to 90% in the middle, and that will give them 4 things, so that they know what a municipality is and what it does. This is the educating and the informing aspect. So that they feel like their voice, if they express it, can affect some sort of change. But in that doesn't always mean that they always get what they want. It's about understanding their voice is one of many, many voices. That there is a possibility it can change things, but it might be in tension with others. More importantly then, I think, is then that they feel like they have a connection with that municipality. That feeling you described at the start, feeling that someone is there for you, feeling that someone understands you, feeling that someone has created space for you, is that feeling of connection to your city's decision-making, your region's decision-making, your municipality's decision-making, is probably what we're trying to create. And I don't think there's necessarily this one way to do that, but it's probably about having multiple opportunities, spaces and places where people can go to express their voice in that way, and to have that feeling created and satisfied in a way. Because it's too simplistic to say that listening to people is about them always getting what they want. So it's the kind of emotional dimension under it that we need to attend to a little bit, and that we make sure that everyone feels that connection to our cities, to our town halls, maybe even to our politicians. Well, they're a slightly different kettle of fish. And this is, I think, what it means to be listened to by a municipality. And I think whenever you talk about meaningful participation over the next couple of days, whenever you talk about doing things the right way or improving the quality of what you're doing, we'd maybe suggest to do a bit of a sense check and say, is actually what you mean by that very specific forms and types that are ones that you're invested in, or is it about spreading this feeling as wide as you possibly can? That pretty much brings me to the end of my space. I think I hand over to Bruno again now. Thank you.